Three strikes laws focus on felony offenses. Since 1994 in California, if a defendant is convicted of any felony with 2 or more prior convictions, strikes on their record, the law mandates a state prison term of at least 25 years to life. In 2003, a man convicted of felony petty theft of videos from a rental store, along with another man convicted of stealing 3 golf clubs from a sporting goods store, were given 25 years to life because they had previous convictions on their records. These are instances of relatively minor, nonviolent crimes which often come with little to no time in prison, leading to maximum sentences. This graph shows the evolution of incarceration rates while highlighting key sentencing legislation. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act is the result of Congress's efforts to establish a war on drugs. Mass incarceration differentially impacts different social groups and contributes to social inequality. Higher levels of police presence in poor neighborhoods increase the likelihood of arrest for community members in those neighborhoods, independent of the amount of crime in the neighborhood. This tells us that all things being equal, including how much crime is actually being committed, poorer members of society are more likely to be arrested. There is inequality in arrests by racial groups as well. This graphic displays racial disparities in arrest rates. Notice that white U.S. citizens have a much lower likelihood of arrest in their lifetime than blacks and Latinos. In an equitable society, if certain social groups are equally likely to commit crimes, then we'd expect all groups to have equal arrest rates. However, African American men in particular have been arrested at stunning rates, primarily for nonviolent, relatively minor drug offenses, despite data indicating that people of all races use and sell drugs at remarkably similar rates. This indicates that African American men are being overrepresented in drug arrests and that there are patterns of racial inequality in the criminal justice system. According to survey researchers, 76% of drug users in the U.S. are white, 14% are black, and 8% are Hispanic. Yet black Americans make up 35% of all drug arrests and 55% of all drug convictions. The second percentage indicates that other races are more likely to get acquitted than blacks. This chart shows the disparity in the drug arrest rate between blacks and whites across a sample of cities in the U.S. According to this research, blacks are 3.4 times as likely as whites to be arrested for drug offenses, despite using and selling drugs at about the same rates. This chart shows that after reaching the courtroom, blacks are less likely to be acquitted or given community-based sentences, making them 10.1 times more likely to go to prison for drug crimes than whites. One of the explanations for this incredibly large disparity is structural racism in the form of sentencing laws. Though crack and cocaine are similar narcotics derived from the same source, that is, they are considered pharmacologically identical, cause similar effects on users, and are equally dangerous, federal minimum mandatory sentences established in the 1980s treat users of these drugs differently upon conviction. There is a 5-year minimum prison sentence for first-time trafficking offenders of both crack and cocaine. However, the amount with which the trafficker must be caught to trigger this sentence is different for the two drugs. A drug trafficker must be in possession of 100 times the amount of cocaine as a crack trafficker to trigger the same minimum sentencing requirement: 500 grams of cocaine versus 5 grams of crack. Because of this, cocaine traffickers receive much lighter sentences than crack traffickers, despite the almost identical nature, effects, and danger of the two drugs. This chart compares cocaine and crack use by race. It demonstrates that Black Americans are more likely to use crack cocaine and white Americans are more likely to use cocaine. Based on racial patterns in drug use, treating crack more harshly than cocaine differentially impacts blacks by increasing their time in prison relative to whites. This is an example of institutionalized discrimination, because while the laws are not written with the intent to discriminate against blacks, they end up doing so. Researchers find that there is typically less harsh legal treatment of drug offenses when the drugs are predominantly used by a majority group in society. Advocates argue that harsh minimum sentences are meant to provide law enforcement with tools to negotiate with drug users and traffickers and get them to flip on other traffickers. However, evidence by the Justice Department from their Smart on Crime initiative starting in 2013 shows that reducing minimum sentencing for drug crimes does not impact the amount of cooperation from defendants. Over the last 2 years, this initiative has helped to reduce the number of minimum sentences for nonviolent drug trafficking offenses to its lowest level since the mandatory minimum sentence laws were introduced. Criminal justice reformers support this initiative, claiming that the consensus in both the legal and academic communities is that these overly harsh sentences don't improve public safety, reduce recidivism, or deter would-be offenders. This initiative is a large part of the movement to roll back the war on drugs. The recent legalization of marijuana in some states will also reduce the amount of drug-related convictions.